My stepson thought he could inherit the engine just because he inherited the title. He fired me just 2 days after his mother, my late wife Eleanor, was lowered into the frozen Chicago ground. He stood in my own living room surrounded by his Ivy League sycophants and laughed as security escorted me out into the winter rain. He called me a dinosaur. He thought he had won. What Bradley Becker did not know was that he had only inherited the operating shell, not the engine. He didn't know that I, Donald Becker, still own 100% of the physical trucks and the proprietary biomedical tracking software that makes the company run. He thought he was throwing out the trash, but he was actually throwing away the keys to his own kingdom. Monday morning is going to be very interesting. My name is Donald Becker. I am 68 years old. I have spent my life with grease under my fingernails and diesel fuel in my veins. I built Becker Global Logistics from a single dented refrigerator truck into a transportation empire. We don't just ship boxes, we ship life. We transport temperature-sensitive oncology drugs, pediatric vaccines, and clinical trials for major hospital networks across the Midwest. I know every wire in our BioShield pods and every line of code in our TempTrack system. But to my stepson Bradley and his wife Chloe, I was just the help that stuck around too long. Let me know in the comments if you have ever been underestimated by someone who has never worked a hard day in their life. The disrespect began before the dirt even hit the casket. It was a Tuesday in November, and Chicago was living up to its reputation. The wind cut across the cemetery like a razor, carrying a freezing rain that soaked through my black wool coat. I stood by the grave of Eleanor, the woman I had loved for 30 years. I did not feel the cold. I only felt the massive gaping hole in my chest where my heart used to be. I wanted to stand there until she was covered warm and safe. I owed her that respect. But Bradley had other plans. 50 yards away on the paved path, a black Mercedes SUV sat idling. The engine was running to keep the heater blasting. Through the tinted window, I could see Bradley. He wasn't crying. He was looking at his phone, thumbs flying across the screen. He hadn't even stepped out onto the grass because he didn't want to get mud on his $2,000 Italian loafers. I watched the window roll down just 2 in. Bradley shouted at the foreman of the cemetery crew, "Hey, can we speed this up? I have a schedule to keep." The foreman looked at me embarrassed. I nodded slowly, giving him permission to continue. That was the first strike. Bradley treated his mother's burial like a logistics delay, a traffic jam he needed to clear so he could get back to his comfortable life. I walked over to the car as the crew began to shovel the earth. I tapped on the glass. Bradley rolled the window down halfway, looking annoyed. "Get in, Donald. You're soaking wet and you smell like wet dog. We need to get to the reception. The board members are waiting." I looked at him. This boy was 32 years old. He had an MBA on his wall and a silver spoon in his mouth that I had paid for. I spoke quietly. "Your mother is being buried, Bradley. Turn off the engine and show some respect." He scoffed, rolling his eyes. "She's gone, Donald. Standing in the rain isn't going to bring her back. Besides, Chloe is waiting for us at the house to go over the catering bill." I turned my back on him and walked back to the grave. I stood there for another 20 minutes until the last spade of dirt smoothed over the mound. I said my final goodbye to Eleanor, promising her I would try to keep the peace. I didn't know then that peace was already impossible. The reception was held at our home, a sprawling estate in Lake Forest, that Eleanor and I had bought 10 years ago. When I walked in dripping wet, it didn't feel like a house of mourning. It felt like a corporate mixer. The music was playing a little too loudly. The guests weren't family and neighbors. They were consultants, lawyers, and Bradley's sycophants from the country club. They were drinking my vintage scotch, talking about mergers. I went upstairs to change into a dry suit. When I came down, I tapped a spoon against a champagne glass. I wanted to thank everyone for coming. I wanted to share how Eleanor used to handle dispatch in the early days. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice raspy. Before I could get the second sentence out, Bradley stepped in front of me. He was wearing a suit that cost more than my first truck. He clapped his hands, cutting me off, stealing the room's attention. "Thank you all for being here," Bradley boomed, his voice practiced and smooth. "It is a sad day, but also a day of new beginnings. As per my mother's wishes and the board's ratification this morning, I am stepping into the role of CEO effective immediately. There was polite applause. I stood there stunned. We hadn't even read the will yet. But Bradley wasn't finished. He turned to me, a smile plastered on his face that didn't reach his cold blue eyes. And we have to thank Donald for his decades of service. Bradley reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He held it out to me in front of everyone. It wasn't a gift. It was a prop. Donald, we know how hard you've worked, but the company is moving in a new digital direction. We think it is time for you to finally rest. Inside is a very generous severance package and retirement papers. We call it the Golden Parachute. The room went deadly silent. This was a public execution. He was firing me at my wife's funeral reception. He was handing me a pink slip while I was still grieving. I looked at the envelope. I didn't take it. Bradley, I said, my voice low and dangerous. What is this? It's called progress, Donald, he whispered, leaning in close so only I could hear. You're a mechanic. You fix trucks. I run corporations. You don't fit the new image. Look at you. You're old. You're tired. And frankly, you're not the face of a tech-forward logistics firm. I looked around the room. I saw Chloe, his wife, smirking in the corner sipping a martini. She gave a little wave. I realized then that this had been planned for months. They were just waiting for Eleanor to die. I took the envelope. I did not open it. I knew exactly what was inside. An insult wrapped in corporate paper. Is that it? I asked, keeping my voice steady. Not quite, Bradley said. He snapped his fingers. Two men in dark suits stepped forward. They weren't my usual security team. I knew all my guards by name, men who had stood watch for years, whose wives and kids I knew. These men were strangers, heavy muscle hired from a private firm for dirty work. Since you're no longer with the company, Bradley said, I can't have you on the premises, and since this house is mine now, you have to leave. Leave, I repeated. This is my home. Eleanor and I built this place. It was, Bradley corrected with a smug grin. Now it's corporate housing for the CEO, which is me. You can pick up your personal effects from the office tomorrow. Security will escort you out. One of the guards stepped into my personal space, putting a heavy hand on my elbow. It was a light touch, but the threat was heavy. I looked at Bradley, the boy I had raised since he was 10. I didn't see a son. I saw a stranger who had waited for his mother to die just to steal my life's work. I pulled my arm away from the guard. I don't need help walking, I said, straightening my tie. You are making a mistake, Bradley. Bradley laughed, a dry, arrogant sound. The only mistake was thinking you could stay in the big leagues forever, Donald. Go enjoy your retirement. Leave the business to the professionals. I nodded, gripping the envelope. Careful, son. That chair you are sitting in is hotter than you think. You don't have the key to the engine. I turned and walked to the front door, the guards close behind. Bradley called out, Leave your badge tomorrow. I stepped out into the cold November rain. Behind me, the heavy mahogany door slammed shut and locked with a dull final thud. I stood on the porch looking at the house Eleanor and I had filled with memories. I was 68, wet, cold, and homeless, fired from the company I built with my bare hands. Most men would have broken. But I am not most men. I walked down the long driveway, feeling the cold metal of a flash drive in my pocket. Bradley thought he had taken everything. He forgot that 10 years ago, I separated the assets, restructuring the holding company to protect it from someone like him. I took out my phone, wiping the rain from the screen. I dialed a number. Diana, I said when she answered. Donald, is everything okay? I heard about the funeral. I am so sorry, my lawyer said. Save the condolences, Diana, I said. Initiate Protocol 0. There was a pause. Then Diana's sharp voice cut through. Are you sure, Donald? Once we start this, there is no going back. It will freeze the operating company. I looked back at the mansion, seeing Bradley's silhouette raising a glass to his friends. I am sure, I said. Let's see how he drives with no engine. I hung up and walked into the dark. Monday morning was coming, and it was going to be a bloodbath for Bradley's digital dreams. At 9 sharp the next morning, I arrived at Becker Global Logistics. The steel and glass tower stood tall against the gray Chicago skyline. I parked in the visitor lot, knowing my reserved spot was already taken by Bradley's Mercedes. I walked up the steps, reaching for the brass handle. Inside, the lobby smelled sterile, like ozone and expensive perfume, replacing the warm scent of lemon polish and fresh coffee that used to welcome our drivers. I swiped my worn badge at the security gate. Instead of a green light, it let out a harsh buzz. The red light flashed an angry red, and the small digital screen displayed two cold words: "Access denied. Card deactivated." A young receptionist I didn't recognize called out, "You can't be in here without a pass." "I am Donald Becker," I said. "I founded this company. I'm here to collect my things." She typed and frowned. "I don't have you in the active directory. Wait on that bench while I verify your story." I stood my ground. The large oil painting of my first truck was gone, replaced by a neon sign that said "Disrupt" in bright pink. This was no longer my company. It was a sterile playground for children who had never changed a tire or felt the vibration of a diesel engine. I waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Employees walked by, people I had hired, people whose mortgages I had helped pay. They looked at the floor, looking anywhere but at me. Fear is a powerful silencer. Bradley had clearly made an example of anyone who showed loyalty to the old regime. Finally, the elevator doors pinged open. It was not Bradley who stepped out. It was Chloe. She was wearing a white power suit that cost more than my father made in a lifetime. She walked across the marble floor, her high heels clicking a sharp, aggressive rhythm. She was carrying a cardboard box, a simple brown beat-up cardboard box. She stopped 5 feet away from me. She did not say hello. She did not offer condolences. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and disgust. "We anticipated you might show up, Donald," Chloe said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "So I took the liberty of packing up your office myself. We could not have you wandering the halls disrupting the workflow. We are very busy pivoting to the new model." She held the box out, but she did not hand it to me. She let it drop. The box hit the floor with a heavy thud, echoing in the silent lobby. I heard the distinct crack of glass breaking inside. I slowly bent down. My knees ached, but I did not let it show. I picked up the photograph of Eleanor from the floor, brushing the shards of glass off her face with my thumb. The picture was taken on the day we opened our first warehouse 25 years ago. We were covered in dust, exhausted but smiling like we owned the world. Now a jagged crack ran right through her smile. "This is not junk, Chloe," I said softly, looking up at her. "This is history." "History doesn't pay the bills, Donald," she snapped, her polite mask slipping. "We are rebranding. We are getting rid of the old, dusty blue-collar image. And that includes you and your sentimental trash. Take your debris and go. Security will be here in 2 minutes to escort you off the property for trespassing." Before I could answer, the automatic lobby doors slid open behind me. Bradley walked in, flanked by 2 security guards. He looked fresh, rested, and arrogant. He saw the box on the floor and smirked. "I see Chloe handled the trash," Bradley said, walking over. "Good. But there is one more thing, Donald. The keys." He held out his hand, palm up. I looked at him. "Which keys?" "The company car," Bradley said. "The Lincoln. It's a company asset, and since you are no longer an officer of the company, you cannot drive it. Also, the phone. The one in your pocket. The bill is paid by Becker Global." "Hand it over." This was petty. He wanted to strip me of everything, to leave me on the curb with a box of broken glass, unable to drive or even call for a ride. He wanted to see me broken, walking down the street like a beggar. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the keys to the Lincoln Town car. I had driven that car for 8 years. It had over 200,000 miles on it, and I loved every mile. I dropped the keys into his hand. Then I took out the phone. I had already wiped all the data the night before thanks to Protocol Zero. It was just a piece of plastic and glass now. I placed it on top of the keys. "Is that everything?" I asked. "Or do you want the shirt off my back too?" Bradley laughed, closing his fist around the keys. "Keep the shirt, old man. You're going to need it. It's cold out there in the real world." He turned to the guards. "Make sure he walks off the property. If he stops, if he looks back, arrest him." I picked up the cardboard box. It was heavy with the weight of 30 years of memories. I held the box with one arm and the broken picture of Eleanor with the other. I turned my back on Bradley and Chloe. I walked toward the exit, the guards following close behind. The young receptionist watched me go, her mouth slightly open. As I walked past the security turnstiles, one of the guards, a man named Mike whom I had hired 5 years ago, looked at me. I saw the shame in his eyes. He didn't want to do this, but he had a family to feed. I gave him a small nod, letting him know I did not blame him. I stepped out into the biting wind. The glass door slid shut behind me, locking with a dull hum. I was standing on the sidewalk. My office was gone. My title was gone. I began to walk. I did not look for a taxi. I just walked. The cardboard box dug into my side, and the cold wind stung my eyes. But I did not feel defeated. I felt lighter. They had taken the symbols of power, but they had not taken the source. I walked 2 blocks to a small diner where the coffee was hot and the owner knew my name. I sat in a corner booth, placed the box on the seat opposite me, and asked the waitress for a black coffee. I looked at the broken picture of Eleanor. "Don't worry, honey," I whispered to the glass. "We are just getting started." Later that afternoon, I moved into a wobbly third-floor walk-up in a run-down part of Chicago. I had rented it using cash under a fake name to keep Bradley's lawyers from finding me too quickly. The apartment was cramped, with wallpaper peeling in the corners and a radiator that clanked and hissed, spitting out a dry heat. It was a far cry from the 10,000-square-foot mansion in Lake Forest. But as I looked around, I felt a strange sense of familiarity. This was where Eleanor and I had started. This was the kind of place where we had lived when we were young, counting pennies to buy diesel. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, eating a simple sandwich. I had not eaten in 24 hours. My stomach growled, but my appetite was gone, replaced by a cold, simmering rage. I was 68 years old, a multi-millionaire on paper, eating a cheap sandwich in a room that cost less than Bradley's shoes. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh, but the laughter died in my throat when I heard a heavy, hesitant knock at the door. I stiffened. Very few people knew where I was. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. The distorted face on the other side was wearing a grease-stained cap. It was Otis. I opened the door. Otis stood there, twisting his cap in his large, calloused hands. He was wearing his Becker Global mechanic uniform, but the patch with his name had been ripped off, leaving a dark square on the chest. Otis was 60 years old and had been with me for 35 of them. He was the first mechanic I ever hired, a man who could fix a transmission in a blizzard. Today he looked broken beyond repair. "Boss," Otis said, his voice cracking. "I didn't know where else to go," I asked around at the diner. "They said you might be here." "Come in, Otis," I said, stepping aside. "I don't have much to offer, but I have a chair." Otis walked in, looking around the small room with sad, tired eyes. He sat heavily on the cheap wooden chair by the window and looked down at his scuffed work boots. "They fired me, Donald," Otis said softly. The words hung in the air like smoke. I knew Bradley was cleaning house to make room for his new automated system, but I thought he would have the sense to keep the head of maintenance. You cannot run a biomedical logistics company without the man who keeps the cooling systems running. "Why?" I asked, sitting opposite him. "Did they give a reason?" Otis let out a bitter laugh and pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket, smoothing it out on his knee. It was a termination notice. The reason listed was inability to adapt to new technological standards. "Tech standards," I muttered. "Otis, you can diagnose an engine problem or a thermostat failure just by listening to the compressor. You're the best biomedical cooling technician in the Midwest." "That doesn't matter anymore, Donald," Otis said, tears welling up in his eyes. "Bradley brought in these consultants. They gave us all iPads. They said we had to log every single seal replacement, every coolant level check, and every temperature calibration into this new cloud system. I tried. Donald, I really tried, but my fingers are thick and the arthritis makes it hard to press those tiny buttons. I couldn't navigate the menus fast enough." He looked up, and the raw pain in his face broke my heart. "Bradley came down to the garage this morning. He saw me struggling with the tablet. He didn't ask about the 3 BioShield pods I had just fixed in record time. He just looked at the screen, laughed, and told his assistant, 'Get rid of these dinosaurs. If they can't swipe a screen, they can't work for Becker.' Then he fired the whole senior maintenance crew. Anyone over 50. Anyone who didn't look like they belonged in a Silicon Valley startup. Fired us on the spot. No severance, no notice. He said because we couldn't log the data, we were in breach of safety protocols." Otis put his face in his hands. "I have a mortgage, Donald. My wife needs expensive daily insulin. I have 2 years until I can claim Social Security." I don't know what to do. Who is going to hire a 60-year-old mechanic who can't swipe an iPad? I looked at Otis shaking in that cheap chair. This was a man who had worked double shifts in freezing blizzards to make sure cancer drugs didn't freeze on the highway. He was the backbone of Becker Global, and Bradley had discarded him like a used oil filter because he didn't fit the high-tech aesthetic. This was not just business anymore. This was a crime against decency. Bradley was erasing the human foundation of Becker Global. I stood up, the grief in my chest replaced by a white-hot protective rage. I walked over and put a hand on Otis's shoulder. His jacket smelled of solvent and old grease, the smell of honest work. "Listen to me, Otis," I said, my voice firm. "You go home to your wife. You tell her that Donald said everything is going to be fine. Your medical insurance is not going to lapse. I will cover it." "But how?" Otis asked, looking up. "You're out too, boss. You're in this dump. You can't help us." I smiled a grim, tight smile. "I am down, Otis, but I am not out, and I am definitely not broke. Bradley thinks he took my power because he took my chair. He forgot that I own the building the chair sits in. I went to the nightstand and picked up the prepaid burner phone I had bought at the corner store. I dialed Diana's number. It rang twice before she answered. Diana Albright, attorney at law. "Diana, it's Donald," I said. "Donald, I've been trying to reach you," she said, her voice filled with relief. "The board is in chaos. Bradley is announcing a massive automated partnership with TechStream tomorrow morning. He is claiming he has fully modernized the fleet." "He didn't modernize it," I said, looking at Otis. "He gutted it. He fired the senior maintenance crew. He fired Otis." There was a long silence on the line. Diana knew Otis. She knew he was family. "That foolish boy," Diana whispered. "Does he not know that the federal regulations for biomedical shipping require physical signatures and manual override records from a certified master technician? He thinks an app can do it," I said. "But that is not why I am calling, Diana. I want you to execute the nuclear option." "Donald, wait," she cautioned. "If we do that, we freeze everything, the accounts, the assets, the fleet. It will cost millions in lost revenue. It could bankrupt the operating company." I looked at Otis, who was wiping his eyes with a dirty rag, and thought about Bradley's arrogant smile. "I don't care about the revenue, Diana. I built that company from zero. I can build it again, but I will not let him use my legacy to starve my people. Open the safe in your office. Pull out the master lease agreement for Becker Holdings. Look at Section 4, Paragraph C. I heard the sound of papers shuffling on the other end. Diana was fast. "I have it," she said. "The clause regarding essential personnel and intellectual property integrity." "Read it," I commanded. "It says," Diana paused, and I could hear the sharp realization in her voice that the lease of all heavy machinery, refrigerated pods, and the license for the TempTrack software is strictly contingent upon the contiguous employment of key certified personnel designated by the chairman. "And who is the chairman, Diana?" "You are, Donald." "And who are the designated key personnel?" She read further. "The list includes the chief operations officer and the head of maintenance, Otis." "Exactly," I said. By firing Otis, Bradley didn't just fire a mechanic. He violated the master lease agreement. He legally voided his right to use my trucks and my software. I want you to draft the cease and desist order tonight, Diana. But don't send it yet. Let him have his press conference with TechStream tomorrow. Let him stand on that stage and brag about his automated future. "I understand," Diana said. "We hit him when the spotlight is brightest, precisely. And Diana, transfer $50,000 from my personal trust to Otis's account. Tell him it's a consulting fee. I need him ready." "Ready for what?" Otis asked, standing up. "Ready to get back to work," I said. I hung up the phone. Bradley wanted a war between the old and the new. He was about to learn that T-Rex was a dinosaur too, and it had a bite that could snap his digital empire in half. The next morning, I sat in my cramped kitchen and watched the world change through the cracked screen of my prepaid burner phone. I had created an anonymous profile to monitor the company's public channels. Bradley was live streaming a tour of the office. The lobby walls, once a warm professional beige, were now painted a jarring neon orange. The heavy mahogany desk where Eleanor and I had signed our first major contracts was gone, replaced by a glass table that looked like it would shatter if you slammed a mug on it. Bradley held the phone high, angling the camera to show off his slim-fit designer suit and the sweeping views of the city. He was talking fast, throwing around buzzwords that meant absolutely nothing. Synergy, paradigm shifts, technological disruption. He walked past the open conference room, showing off his new hires. They were all young, wearing matching branded hoodies, looking more confused than confident. Then, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. The caller ID showed Bradley's name. He was calling me while still on the live stream, eager to rub his victory in my face. I slid my thumb across the screen. "Donald," Bradley boasted, his voice loud. "I hope you're watching the feed. We are about to make history." "I am watching, Bradley," I said, keeping my voice calm. "You painted the lobby orange. It looks like a high-end prison cafeteria." Bradley laughed, a sharp, dismissive bark. "That's the color of innovation, old man. I'm calling to give you a courtesy heads-up. In exactly 1 hour, I am signing our exclusive contract with TechStream. We are going to be the first fully automated, AI-driven biomedical logistics fleet in the country. No more manual logs, no more old mechanics with grease under their fingernails. Just pure, clean data." I leaned back in my wobbly wooden chair. TechStream. I knew their CEO Dominic very well. He was a corporate shark who had tried to pitch me his automated routing platform 5 years ago. I had read his standard contract back then. It was a parasite agreement designed to suck the cash flow out of logistics firms while transferring all operational risk to the provider. "Be careful, Bradley," I said quietly. "TechStream's platform has strict requirements. They demand a 99.9% uptime guarantee. If a single BioShield pod fails and a vaccine shipment spoils, the federal penalties and contract breach fees are devastating. You don't have the cash reserves for that." Bradley scoffed, rolling his eyes on screen. "That's old-school thinking, Donald. That's why you're sitting in a cheap rental and I'm in the executive office. With Dominic's predictive AI, equipment failure is mathematically impossible. Welcome to the future. You should look it up on Google if you can figure out how to open the browser." He hung up before I could answer. He wanted the final punchline. He wanted to feel like the smartest man in Chicago. He did not realize he was walking off a cliff. I switched off the phone and turned on a small, static-filled television I had bought from the pawn shop down the street. It was time for the main event. The local business news channel was covering the signing ceremony live, calling it the logistics merger of the decade. The camera cut to the grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton. It was packed with reporters, investors, and photographers. Bradley stood on a raised platform next to Dominic, the CEO of TechStream. Dominic looked like a predator who had just spotted a wounded sheep. He was smiling, but his eyes were cold and calculating. Chloe stood just behind Bradley, wearing a silver dress that sparkled under the heavy studio lights, waving to the cameras desperate for the spotlight. On the table in front of them sat 2 thick leather binders containing the contracts. I leaned forward, my eyes fixed on the screen. This was the trap I had set years ago without even knowing it. When I had rejected TechStream's proposal 5 years ago, I had drafted a counter-proposal detailing a highly rigorous fleet maintenance standard. I had filed that standard legally as the Becker Protocol. I knew Dominic was lazy. He would use the template from our previous negotiations because he believed my operational standards were the gold standard of the industry. He would include the Becker Protocol in Appendix C, Section 4 of the contract to guarantee quality to his own board. But here was the catch. The Becker Protocol explicitly required every refrigerated truck and BioShield pod to be physically inspected and certified by a master technician with at least 15 years of biomedical experience. When Bradley fired Otis and the entire senior maintenance crew, he destroyed the only team legally certified to execute the Becker Protocol. On the screen, Bradley picked up a heavy gold pen. He flashed his white teeth for the cameras. He didn't open the binder. He didn't read the fine print. He didn't turn to Appendix C. If he had, he would have seen that any failure to maintain the fleet according to the certified Becker Protocol would constitute an immediate default. And in the event of default, the contract gave TechStream the legal right to seize the operating company's accounts and assets to cover their losses. Bradley signed his name with a wide theatrical flourish. He signed his own corporate death warrant. Dominic signed next, his smile widening. I saw the look in Dominic's eyes. He knew. He knew Bradley was a clueless MBA who had just fired his entire support structure. Dominic wasn't partnering with Becker Global. He was preparing to swallow it whole. The room erupted in applause, and flashbulbs popped like lightning. Bradley hugged Chloe, looking like a king who had just conquered an empire. The microphone picked up Bradley's voice. "To the future," he said. "To the future," Dominic replied, his voice dripping with satisfaction. I turned off the television. The screen went black, and I saw my own reflection. My face was a mask of cold resolve. Bradley had just guaranteed a 99.9% uptime to a predatory tech firm using a fleet of refrigerated trucks that were due for their quarterly FDA-mandated compressor overhauls next week. And he had done it after banning the only certified mechanics from the building. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked at the dark sky. The storm was coming. I picked up my burner phone and sent a single text to Otis. "It is signed. Get the crew ready." Otis replied instantly. "We're ready, Donald." I looked back at the blank television. "Enjoy the champagne, Bradley," I said to the empty room. "Drink it all, because by this time next week, you won't even be able to afford the water." While Bradley was busy toasting his own brilliance in Chicago, a crisis was unfolding 70 miles outside the city on the shoulder of Interstate 90. The wind was howling across the flat Illinois plains, dropping the temperature to a freezing 10 degrees below zero. Truck number 452, a heavy refrigerator rig carrying a 2,000,000 shipment of experimental pediatric gene therapy drugs, sat dead in the pitch darkness. The driver was Winston. He was a veteran driver who had been with me for 15 years, a family man who knew his truck's cooling compressor better than he knew his own backyard. When the digital warning lights on his dashboard started to flash and the temperature inside the BioShield pod began to rise, Winston knew exactly what was wrong. It was a faulty pressure valve in the primary cooling loop, a common issue in freezing temperatures if the seals weren't physically greased during the seasonal check. In the old days, Winston would have picked up his CB radio and called Otis directly. Otis would have diagnosed it in 10 seconds. He would have told Winston exactly which valve to manually tap or bypass to keep the compressor running long enough to reach the next service bay, where a replacement part would already be waiting. But Otis's radio channel was dead silence now. Bradley had shut down the analog dispatch network on his first day, calling it obsolete. Instead, Winston had to use the new cloud dispatch app on the iPad Bradley had mounted to the dashboard. With freezing fingers, he tapped the screen, navigating through 5 different menus just to find the incident report page. The app kept lagging, asking for his employee identification PIN and biometric validation. When he finally got a connection, he wasn't talking to a certified dispatch manager in Chicago. He was talking to an outsourced call center operator halfway across the world who had never seen a semi-truck in real life. "Please hold while I generate a service ticket," a pleasant, automated voice said through the speaker. "I don't have time for a ticket," Winston shouted into the microphone, his breath turning to ice inside the freezing cab. "My engine is running, but the cooling unit on the trailer is dead. The temperature inside the pod is already up to 38 degrees. These are oncology and gene therapy drugs for a children's hospital. If they go above 40 degrees, the entire load is ruined. I need a master mechanic and a heavy-duty tow truck right now." "I understand your concern, sir," the operator replied calmly. "But according to our database, your vehicle was flagged as fully optimized by our TechStream predictive maintenance algorithm yesterday morning. The software indicates your cooling compressor is operating at 100% efficiency. There are no scheduled maintenance alerts for your route." "The software is wrong," Winston yelled, slamming his hand against the steering wheel. "The physical pressure valve is frozen shut. The coolant is leaking onto the highway. Send a mobile mechanic. Send Otis." "So I'm sorry, sir, but the name Otis does not appear in our active service directory," the operator said. "I cannot manually override the TechStream dispatch queue. I will escalate this ticket to our systems administrator for review. The current response time is 24 hours. Please remain with your vehicle." Winston swore, ripping the iPad from its dashboard mount and throwing it onto the passenger seat. He wrapped his heavy blanket around his shoulders and looked out the frosted windshield at the snow whipping across the highway. He was alone in the freezing dark, and he knew that by sunrise, $2,000, thousand worth of life-saving medicine, would be nothing but worthless warm liquid. Bradley's digital dream was freezing to death on the side of the road, and the new CEO didn't even know it yet. Back in the city, the grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel was warm and smelled of expensive lilies and unearned success. Chloe had outdone herself. She had taken the emergency maintenance reserve fund, the money I kept in a separate account for exactly the kind of roadside emergency Winston was facing, and spent it on what she called the Becker Global Rebranding Gala. I stood near the entrance, hidden in the shadows of a large marble pillar, and watched them burn my legacy. There were ice sculptures carved in the shape of their new pink logo. There were waiters circulating with silver trays of caviar and vintage champagne. The floral arrangements alone must have cost more than a complete engine overhaul. Chloe was wearing her silver designer dress, laughing loudly as she held court with a group of investment bankers and social media consultants who had never seen a shipping dock. Bradley stood next to her, looking like a prince who had just been crowned. He was gesturing wildly as he told a story to a group of potential investors, clearly drunk on his own ego. I adjusted my tuxedo. It was a classic black suit, tailored to fit me 20 years ago. It wasn't trendy, but it was authoritative. I walked out of the shadows and stepped onto the polished ballroom floor. The room went quiet. The silence started near the entrance and spread like a wave through the crowd until the live jazz band stopped playing. Heads turned. Whispers broke out. People I had hired, people whose families I had supported, parted from me like the Red Sea. They saw a man who carried himself with the dignity of a founder. Bradley saw me coming, and his plastic smile faltered. He looked around for security, but the guards at the door didn't move. I had walked in with Dominic, the CEO of TechStream. Dominic had invited me himself, thinking it would be an amusing power play to force the old lion to watch the young wolf take his place. Dominic did not realize that the old lion still had his teeth, and the wolf was already stepping into a trap. I stopped directly in front of Bradley and Chloe. Up close, I could see the light film of sweat on Bradley's forehead, despite the air conditioning. "What are you doing here, Donald?" Bradley hissed, keeping his voice low so the investors wouldn't hear. "You were escorted off the property. You're not on the guest list." I smiled, a cold, dry smile. "Dominic insisted," I said. "He wanted me to see the future of Becker Global." Chloe stepped forward. She looked at my classic black tuxedo and sneered. "You look like a waiter, Donald. Did you come to bus tables because we are fully staffed? We have professionals handling the service tonight." I looked at Chloe, then down at the glittering diamond bracelet on her wrist. I knew exactly what that bracelet cost because I knew exactly how much money was missing from the emergency maintenance reserve fund she had raided. "That is a lovely bracelet, Chloe," I said, keeping my voice low. "It costs us about the same as 3 transmission rebuilds. I hope it's worth it when the refrigeration units start failing and the client invoices come due." Chloe turned pale, her hand instinctively covering her wrist. She didn't think I knew about the fund. Bradley stepped between us, trying to puff out his chest to look intimidating. "Get out, Donald," he whispered violently. "Get out before I have security throw you out. You are ruining the vibe of our launch party." "I am not the one ruining anything, Bradley," I said. I leaned in close to his ear. The loud jazz music covered our conversation, but I made sure he heard every single syllable. Right now, Truck 452 is sitting dead on Interstate 90 in a sub-zero blizzard. The driver is freezing. The load of pediatric gene therapy drugs is spoiled. Bradley rolled his eyes, letting out a dry scoff. "Stop with the drama, Donald." I have the TechStream Manager console open on my phone. The system shows green across the board. The algorithm is optimizing every route as we speak. "The system is just a screen," Bradley, I said. "The reality is oil, steel, and temperature. You have a massive leak. The high-pressure valve on the entire fleet of 2018 models is faulty in freezing temperatures. I had a schedule to replace them starting Monday morning, but you fired the only team that knew how to do it." Bradley laughed. He actually laughed, looking back at his country club friends to make sure they saw him standing up to me. "You're trying to scare me, old man. You're jealous because I am the CEO and you are nothing but a retired mechanic. Go home, Donald. Go home and watch TV." I stepped back, looking at him with genuine pity. "I am going home, Bradley, but you should check your phone. The driver just called the state police to rescue him because your outsourced dispatch center left him to freeze in his cab." When the state police report and the FDA investigation hit the news tomorrow morning, remember this moment. Remember that I told you there was a leak and you chose to buy ice sculptures instead of replacement valves. I turned and walked away. I did not stay for the speeches or the champagne toasts. I walked out of the ballroom, past the confused security guards, and out into the freezing Chicago night. As I waited for a taxi, my burner phone buzzed. It was a text from Otis. "Winston is safe. The state police rescued him from the highway. But the biomedical cargo is completely lost. It spoiled 2 hours ago. And Donald, 3 more drivers just reported check engine lights on their BioShield trailers. They're stuck near Detroit." I looked back at the warm lights of the hotel ballroom. They were celebrating inside a burning building. The oil leak had started. It was just a few frozen valves on a highway, but by morning, it would be a flood that would wash away everything Bradley thought he owned. I got into the taxi. To the south side, I told the driver, Monday was interesting. Tuesday was a tragedy. But Wednesday was going to be Judgment Day. By Thursday morning, the panic in the executive suite of Becker Global had reached a fever pitch. Truck 452 was only the beginning. By noon, 3 more refrigerated trailers had stalled on their routes near Detroit and St. Louis due to the same high-pressure compressor valve failures. Millions of dollars worth of critical pharmaceutical cargo was rotting in trailers across the Midwest. Major hospital networks were calling, their compliance officers screaming about delayed deliveries and violated storage protocols. TechStream was sending urgent, automated warning emails about breach of service level agreements. Bradley was drowning. He sat in my old leather chair, which he hadn't yet managed to replace, and stared at the financial spreadsheets on his screen. He was desperate for cash to pay for emergency mobile mechanics, but he had already spent the entire maintenance reserve on Chloe's launch party and their new branding campaign. That was when he found it. I knew he would find it eventually. I had practically left the breadcrumbs for him. Bradley was digging through the automated payment history of the last 10 years, trying to see where the money was going. He saw a recurring monthly transfer of $50,000 going to an entity listed as Becker Intellectual Properties, LLC. To a mind like Bradley's, a mind trained in corporate shortcuts and greed, this did not look like a legitimate business expense. It looked like a smoking gun. I could imagine the smug smile spreading across his sweaty face. He did not bother to check the corporate registry. He did not bother to ask the legal department for the founding documents of Becker IP. He just saw money leaving the operating account and going into an entity that he did not control. He assumed it was a secret slush fund. He assumed that I, the old mechanic from the South Side, had been skimming profits off the top for decades. He thought he had found the leverage he needed to destroy me and erase my legacy forever. He did not realize that Becker IP was the holding company that owned the physical titles of the trucks and the patents for the BioShield pods he was currently failing to operate. He did not realize he was looking at the rent check, not the robbery, but Bradley didn't care about facts. He cared about his own narrative. He had just found a story that could turn him from an incompetent CEO into a corporate hero who had exposed historical corruption. He picked up the phone. He did not call the company general counsel because he knew they were loyal to the truth. Instead, he called a lawyer who specialized in legal destruction, a man named Henderson who was known for burying people so deep they never saw the sun. Bradley and Henderson spent 4 hours in the executive conference room. They drafted a formal complaint that painted me as a mastermind criminal. They alleged that I had embezzled millions of dollars through shell companies, and that the reason the trucks were breaking down was because I had siphoned off the maintenance funds for my own retirement. It was a beautiful lie, designed to pin all of Bradley's operational failures on my supposed greed. Bradley wanted blood. He told Henderson that he did not just want a civil lawsuit. He wanted an arrest. Bradley used his family's historical connections and the prestige of the Becker name to fast-track a criminal warrant. He spun a story to the district attorney about a flight risk, claiming that I was planning to leave the country with the stolen millions. He didn't just want me out of the company. He wanted to see me in handcuffs. I was sitting in my small, wobbly apartment when the news broke on Thursday evening. My phone buzzed with a notification from a local business blog. The headline read, "Former Becker Global Chairman accused of massive embezzlement scheme." I read the article calmly. It quoted anonymous sources close to the executive suite, detailing the monthly $50,000 transfers to Becker Intellectual Properties LLC as proof of long-term fraud. It went on to praise Bradley Becker, the brave young CEO, for uncovering the financial cancer that had been draining the firm. I put the phone down, looking around my cramped space. The peeling wallpaper was casting long shadows in the dim light of a single bulb. If I had stolen millions, I was doing a terrible job of enjoying the loot. Bradley truly believed I was a criminal because he projected his own greed onto me. He had stolen my chair, so he assumed I must have stolen his money. I stood up and went to the closet. I pulled out my charcoal gray three-piece suit, the one Eleanor had bought me for our 25th wedding anniversary. I put on a crisp white shirt and tied my tie with steady hands. I polished my work shoes until they shone. I was not going to meet them in my pajamas. I was not going to look like the defeated, broken old man they wanted the public to see. I was going to look like the chairman. The sun went down, and the streetlights flickered on. I sat in the wobbly wooden chair facing the door. My hands were flat on my knees. I waited. I knew how Bradley's mind worked. He wouldn't send beat cops during the day. He wanted a theatrical night raid. The flashing blue and red lights in the dark to humiliate me in front of the neighbors, and at exactly 9 p.m., I heard the sirens in the distance. They grew louder until they stopped directly outside my building. I walked to the window. 2 squad cars sat idling at the curb, and a black unmarked sedan pulled up behind them. Through the glare of the flashing lights, I saw Bradley step out of the sedan, accompanied by Henderson. He wanted to watch. He wanted to see his stepfather led away in chains. I heard the heavy, hurried footsteps on the stairs, their boots thudding against the wood. They weren't trying to be quiet. They wanted a show. "Police, open up!" The shout shook the thin doorframe. I did not make them kick it down. I didn't want my landlord to have to pay for a new frame. I walked to the door, unlocked it, and pulled it open. 3 officers stood there, their hands on their holsters, looking tense. When they saw a 68-year-old man in an immaculate 3-piece suit, standing tall and calm, they hesitated. "Donald Becker," the lead officer asked. "I am Donald Becker," I said. My voice was steady. It did not tremble. "You are under arrest for grand larceny, corporate embezzlement, and securities fraud," the officer said, pulling a pair of metal handcuffs from his belt. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." I turned around slowly, offering my wrists. I felt the cold steel click shut, the metal teeth ratcheting tight. They were uncomfortable, but I did not complain. I kept my head high. As they led me out into the hallway, my neighbors were peeking out of their doors. Mrs. Gable from the 3rd floor covered her mouth, tears in her eyes. The young couple from the corner unit looked terrified. "It's all right," I told them as I walked past. "It's just a misunderstanding. Go back to sleep." They marched me down the narrow stairs and out into the biting winter air. The flashing blue lights were blinding, reflecting off the wet pavement. A small crowd of onlookers had gathered on the sidewalk. Standing by the hood of the black sedan was Bradley. He was smiling, his face lit up with absolute victory. He held up his phone and snapped a photo of me in cuffs. "Smile for the camera, Donald," Bradley called out, his voice carrying over the rumble of the idling squad cars. "This is going to be the cover of the Regional Business Journal, the rise and fall of a thief." I stopped. The officer tried to push me forward toward the back seat of the cruiser, but I planted my feet on the concrete. I looked straight at Bradley, past his designer coat and his expensive haircut, right into his insecure soul. "You think you have won, Bradley?" I said, my voice deep and clear enough for everyone to hear. "You think this is the end? You just handed me the microphone." And when I speak, the whole world is going to hear the truth." Bradley laughed, waving his hand dismissively. "Take him away, officers. I have a logistics company to save from this dinosaur." The officer guided my head down and pushed me into the hard plastic back seat of the squad car. The door slammed shut with a heavy metallic clang, locking me in. I leaned back against the plastic, closing my eyes as the tires kicked up gravel and the car pulled away. I watched Bradley through the rear window, shaking hands with Henderson, celebrating his triumph. He looked happy. It was the last time I would ever see him smile. Bradley had taken the bait. He had escalated our corporate dispute to a criminal level, involving the police and the district attorney. He thought he was burying me. He did not realize that by putting me in handcuffs, he was creating a public record of our corporate structure. He had just sued the landlord for collecting the rent, and the court was about to see the lease. The holding cell at the Chicago Central Precinct smelled of bleach, stale coffee, and sweat. It was a smell I knew from my youth, back before I had built my empire, when I was just a kid from the South Side trying to survive. I sat on the cold metal bench and watched the small television mounted in the corner. My face was on every local channel. They had used a mugshot from 30 years ago, a booking photo from a labor union protest I had attended in my 20s. Beside it, they placed a polished headshot of Bradley. He looked concerned, professional, and deeply saddened. The headline scrolled across the bottom of the screen in bright red letters: "Logistics Tycoon Arrested in Multi-Million-Dollar Embezzlement Scheme." The news anchor, a woman with perfect hair and a somber expression, read the script Bradley's PR team had undoubtedly fed her. She spoke about how the innovative young CEO, Bradley Becker, had uncovered a massive financial black hole in the company's accounts. She spoke about betrayal, suggesting that while the firm was struggling to modernize, its founder was draining resources to fund a secret life of luxury. I leaned my head back against the concrete wall. In the span of 3 hours, Bradley had destroyed a reputation I had spent 40 years building. To the public, I was no longer the man who sponsored youth leagues and donated millions to pediatric cancer wards. I was a thief who stole from his own family. The shame should have been crushing, but I felt nothing but a cold, calculating resolve. Bradley had played his best card. He did not realize that paint washes away, but documents are written in permanent ink. The heavy steel door buzzed and swung open. A detective walked in. He was a man in his 50s named Detective Briggs, with tired eyes and a coffee stain on his tie. He carried a thick folder, looking like a man who wanted to close a file and go home to his family. He sat at the metal table, bolted to the floor, and gestured for me to sit opposite him. "All right, Mr. Becker," Briggs said, opening the folder. "We have the bank records. We have the transfer logs. $50,000 a month going into a shell company called Becker Intellectual Properties, LLC. You are the sole signatory on that account. You are paying yourself with company money, and the company has no record of services rendered. It looks pretty bad." I sat down. I did not slouch. I folded my hands on the table. "It looks bad because you are looking at it through a keyhole, detective," I said calmly. "You are seeing the money leave, but you are not asking why. That is not embezzlement. That is rent." Briggs paused, looking up from the file, his brow furrowing. "Excuse me, rent?" I leaned forward, speaking slowly. "Becker Global Logistics is an operating company. It employs the drivers, pays for the fuel, and manages the client relationships. But it does not own the assets. It does not own the refrigerator trucks. It does not own the BioShield pods. And it certainly does not own the patent for the TempTrack software. All of those physical and intellectual assets are owned by a separate holding company, Becker Intellectual Properties, LLC. Briggs frowned, flipping through the bank statements. "I don't see any lease agreements in the corporate file Bradley provided." "That is because Bradley did not give them to you, and he probably didn't bother to read them himself," I said. "He found a payment schedule and assumed it was theft. But if you look at the corporate charter of Becker Global, filed 10 years ago with the Secretary of State, you will find a master service agreement. It states clearly that the operating company must pay a monthly licensing and lease fee to the holding company for the use of the trucks, the brand, and the software. The $50,000 is actually a discounted rate. Market value would be double that. I sat back, resting my hands on my knees. The money is not stolen, detective. It is a contract. And by stopping those payments and having me arrested, Bradley has just triggered a default clause. The door opened again. This time it was the precinct captain, Reynolds. I recognized him immediately. We had served on a local hospital charity board together 5 years ago. He looked at me, then at the folder, his face a mask of confusion. "Donald," Captain Reynolds said, his voice heavy. "What in the hell is going on here?" I get a call from the district attorney saying, "We just booked the Bernie Madoff of the logistics industry, and I come down to find you sitting here like you're running a board meeting." "Hello, Captain," I said with a small smile. "Your detective was just realizing that your department has been used as a weapon in a corporate family dispute." I explained the lease agreement and the holding company setup again. Reynolds listened, his eyes narrowing as he turned to Briggs. "Briggs, pull up the Secretary of State database. Check the registry for Becker Intellectual Properties, LLC. Verify the ownership and the filings. Now." Briggs scrambled to his laptop, his fingers flying across the keys. The room went silent for 2 minutes, save for the clicking of keys and the hum of the ventilation. Then Briggs stopped typing. He looked up, his face pale in the fluorescent light. "He is telling the truth, Captain," Briggs said quietly. "Becker Intellectual Properties is a legally registered LLC, and Donald Becker is the sole owner. The master lease agreement is in the public filings. The payments are fully documented and legal." Reynolds let out a long breath, rubbing his temples. He looked angry. Not at me, but at Bradley. "That arrogant little idiot," Reynolds muttered. "He swore out a criminal complaint for embezzlement to cover up his own corporate mess. He wanted a perp walk for the cameras." He walked over and unlocked my handcuffs. The metal clicked open, and the blood rushed back into my hands. "I am sorry, Donald. We had to act on a signed warrant. We didn't know." "I understand, Captain," I said, rubbing my wrists. "But now I need you to do me a favor." "What kind of favor, Donald?" Captain Reynolds asked, looking at me warily. "Release me on my own recognizance," I said. "But do not announce it to the press. Do not release a statement. Let the media run with the story that I am still locked up. I want Bradley to believe I am rottets in this cell all weekend." "Why?" Detective Briggs asked. "Why would you want the world to keep thinking you're a criminal?" "Because on Monday morning, Bradley has a major shareholder meeting," I said, straightening my jacket. "He is going into that boardroom thinking he has won. He is going to be arrogant, unprepared, and blind. I want him to feel the full height of his success before I pull the rug out from under him." Reynolds looked at me for a long moment, reading the resolve in my eyes. He knew this was about justice for Eleanor and the workers. "We can release you pending further investigation," Reynolds said slowly. "And if you happen to slip out the back door to avoid the reporters in the lobby, that is not something I can control." "Thank you, Captain," I said. As I gathered my wallet and keys, Briggs stopped me. "Mr. Becker, one question. If you own the software and Bradley just arrested you for collecting payment, what happens to the TempTrack system now?" I stopped at the doorway. "The master license agreement is very clear, Detective. In the event of any hostile legal action taken by the tenant against the intellectual property owner, the license is revoked immediately. Becker Global's entire logistics fleet is currently running on pirated software, and come Sunday at noon, I am turning it off." I walked out the back door of the precinct into the cold Chicago alleyway. The night air was freezing, but I felt warm. I had 48 hours to prepare. I had 48 hours to let Bradley believe his own lie before the truth crushed him. Sunday morning arrived. While I sat in my small apartment, drinking instant coffee and reviewing the trust documents with Diana, Bradley and Chloe were popping corks in BGL's executive penthouse suite. They had spent the morning giving exclusive interviews to business journals, describing how they had rescued the firm from the corrupt management of the past. They truly believed their own PR. I could picture the scene perfectly. Chloe would have ordered the most expensive catering available, wearing a designer dress and treating my old office like a runway. Bradley would be sitting in my leather chair, with his feet up on the desk, holding a glass of Dom Perignon looking out over the city. He thought the hard part was over. He thought sending me to jail was the final checkmate. At exactly 12 p.m. on Sunday, the fail-safe code I had programmed into the TempTrack core server executed. It was a simple automated command, a dead man's switch. Every 24 hours, the operating system was required to ping the central server of Becker Intellectual Properties to verify the digital license key. If the server returned an error indicating a legal breach, the operating software would enter a hard lock. The change did not happen with a loud alarm, it happened with a flicker. In BGL's main command center, the massive wall monitors displayed the real-time GPS locations of 3 Muzi's refrigerated trucks carrying millions of dollars of pharmaceutical cargo across North America. It was a vast web of green lights. Then, all at once, the green lights stopped moving. The screens flickered once, twice, and then the map disappeared. The temperature monitoring data, the dispatch schedules, and the route guidance vanished. In their place, a single solid block of color filled every monitor in the room. A bright, angry crimson red. Chloe was the first to notice. The red glow lit up the penthouse office like an emergency light. "What is that, Bradley?" she asked, dropping her champagne glass. "Why did the screens turn red?" Bradley scrambled out of my chair and ran to the main console. He began pounding on the keyboard, thinking it was a screensaver or a minor glitch, but the system was completely unresponsive. In the center of the giant red wall, a message appeared in bold white letters. License expired. Authorization revoked due to breach of contract. System locked. Please contact the intellectual property holder immediately. Bradley stared at the words, his face losing all color. Contact the intellectual property holder. He knew exactly who that was. It was the man he had put in jail. "This is just a computer glitch," Bradley muttered, his hands shaking as he grabbed his phone and dialed the number of his new IT director, a 24-year-old developer named Jason, whom he had hired to replace my veteran staff. "Jason, fix the screens. The system is locked." "I know, boss." Jason's voice trembled over the speaker. "It's not just your office, it's the entire network. The server room is flashing red. The dispatch computers are locked. Even the digital security gates in the warehouses are shut down. We can't log in." "Reboot it," Bradley screamed. "Unplug the mainframes and plug them back in." "We did 3 times, Jason said, panic rising in his voice. "It comes back to the same red screen. It is a hard lock embedded in the firmware. The system is asking for a cryptographic reset key. Do you have it?" "I don't have a key," Bradley yelled. "I am the CEO. Bypass it. Hack the system." "I can't hack it, Bradley," Jason stammered. "This is military-grade encryption. Whoever wrote this code built a trap door, and they just pulled the lever. We are locked out of our own company." Bradley dropped the phone onto the desk. He looked at Chloe, who was standing by the window. The red light from the screens reflected in her eyes, making her look terrified. "Fix this, Bradley," Chloe hissed. "We have investors coming tomorrow morning. Fix this now." But Bradley could not fix it. And then, the phones began to ring. The emergency line in BGL's command center was screaming. It was a cacophony of ringing consoles, the sound of 1,000 operational disasters arriving all at once. Bradley stood frozen, staring at the blinking lights on the phone board, afraid to touch them. When he finally pressed the speakerphone button, the room was filled with the sounds of pure, unadulterated chaos. "This is Dispatch Unit 4 in Ohio," a voice yelled over static. "Our entire dashboard just went blank. We're carrying oncology drugs, and the refrigeration temp is rising. We can't legally drive this rig without the digital log. What is going on?" Before Bradley could answer, another line cut in. "Detroit warehouse manager here. The inventory scanners are dead. The robotic loading arms just froze in midair. We have a shipment of temperature-sensitive pediatric vaccines sitting on the dock, and the automated gates won't open. The cooling systems are off. This stuff is going to spoil in 2 hours. Then a third line chimed. "Port Authority of New York, your trucks are blocking the main cargo terminal. Their electronic RFID passes are being rejected by the gate. You've created a traffic jam 5 miles long. Move your vehicles or we will begin towing them at your expense." Bradley backed away from the console, his hands shaking. The digital trucks he was so proud of were essentially computers on wheels. Without the TempTrack server, their security interlocks locked the brakes. The cooling compressors in the BioShield pods were designed to go into safety shutdown when the license expired, protecting the software but ruining the cargo. Millions of dollars of critical, temperature-sensitive medicine was warming up in trailers across the country. "Make it stop!" Chloe shrieked, covering her ears to block out the ringing phones. "I can't!" Bradley yelled back, running to his laptop. He frantically typed in his administrator credentials, trying to access the cloud backup, but the screen only flashed the same crimson warning: access denied. User account suspended by administrator. There was only one administrator. The man he had put in jail. The private red phone on the desk rang. Bradley flinched. That was the direct line reserved for major partners. He picked up the receiver with a trembling hand. "Dominic, we're experiencing a minor technical glitch. We'll have it sorted in an hour." "Stop lying, Bradley." Dominic's voice was cold as liquid nitrogen. "I am looking at my TechStream dashboard. Your entire fleet has gone dark. You have 0 uptime. Do you know what that means?" "It's just a delay," Bradley stammered, wiping sweat from his forehead. "We can fix it." "It means you are in breach of contract," Dominic cut him off. Section 9, Clause 2. If your uptime drops below 99.9% for more than 4 hours, the penalty clause activates. You have been down for 6. My lawyers are drafting the paperwork right now. You owe TechStream 50,000 nons in performance penalties. 50 million? Bradley screamed, his voice cracking. "We don't have that kind of cash." "I know you don't," Dominic said. "You spent your reserves on marketing. So, we are exercising our corporate lien. We are freezing Becker Global's operating accounts. Every dollar that comes in goes to TechStream until the debt is paid." "Wait," Bradley pleaded. "You can't do that. That will bankrupt us. We won't be able to cover payroll tomorrow morning." "You should have read the contract before signing it, Bradley," Dominic said. "You have until 8 a.m. tomorrow to restore the green lights. If the system is not online by the opening bell of the market, I am going public with the default. Your stock will be worth 0. Good luck." The line went dead. Bradley stood there, holding the silent receiver. The company was broke. The maintenance fund was empty. TechStream was about to freeze their accounts. "You idiot!" Chloe shrieked, throwing her martini glass at Bradley. It missed and shattered against the glass wall. "You told me you had this under control. You told me the software deal was a sure thing." "It was a sure thing," Bradley yelled back, his face turning purple. "How was I supposed to know the old man had a dead man's switch in the code? Because you're the CEO," Chloe screamed. "It's your job to know. But you're not a CEO, are you, Bradley? You're just a little boy playing dress-up in his stepfather's suit. You fired the only people who knew how to run this place. You arrested the man who built it, and now you have ruined our lives." "Do not talk to me like that." Bradley stepped toward her, his fists clenched. "You're the one who spent the money. Where is the emergency maintenance fund? The one we were supposed to use for system overhauls?" Chloe crossed her arms, looking away. "I spent it." "You what? The gala cost money, Bradley. The flowers, the champagne, the Paris diamond bracelet, the weekend retreat in Aspen. You wanted to look like a successful modern tech CEO, didn't you? Well, looking rich costs money. You spent $300,000 of the corporate maintenance fund on jewelry and parties?" Bradley grabbed his hair, pulling at it in sheer frustration. "That was our safety net. That was the money I needed to pay the lawyers and the emergency mechanics." "You are pathetic," Chloe spat, grabbing her designer purse. "You are broke, you are incompetent, and I am leaving for my mother's house. I'm not going to be here when the board evicts us." She turned to leave, but the double doors of the office flew open. It was Henderson, the lawyer. He did not look confident today. His tie was crooked, his suit was rumpled, and he was holding a thick leather binder. "Bradley, stop fighting," Henderson said, his voice breathless. "We have a much bigger problem than TechStream." Bradley stared at Henderson, his chest rising and falling rapidly. What could possibly be worse than a 50,000 default penalty and frozen bank accounts, Henderson? "We are hours from bankruptcy." Henderson slammed the thick leather binder onto the glass conference table. "I just spent the last 3 hours in the basement archives reading the original master source code agreements." The system was designed by Donald and a federal defense contractor 10 years ago when we set up the secure server network. It has a biometric fail-safe override that is hard-coded into the chips. Great, Bradley gasped, a sudden look of hope flashing in his eyes. So we just need a fingerprint to override it. Call Otis. Call one of the senior mechanics. I'll hire them back, whatever it takes. It's not just any fingerprint, Henderson said, shaking his head. The contract is explicit. In the event of a catastrophic system lock caused by a licensing default, the only biometric data that can reset the server is the primary thumbprint of the registered intellectual property owner. Bradley went completely silent, his mouth slightly open. Who is the registered owner? Donald Becker, Henderson said. Only Donald. We need his physical thumbprint on the main server mainframe in the basement. If Donald does not touch that scanner within 24 hours of the lockdown, the firmware triggers a permanent security wipe. The customer database, the temperature logs, the financial records, the route histories, everything goes to zero. Permanent deletion. Bradley sank back into my old leather chair. The magnitude of his error was finally starting to sink in. He had locked up the only man who held the keys to his survival. He is in jail, Bradley whispered, his voice hollow. I put him in jail. The precinct has him on a grand larceny warrant. Then you better get him out, Bradley, Henderson said, closing his folder with a sharp snap. And you better pray he is in a forgiving mood, because right now, Donald Becker is the only thing standing between you and a federal indictment for pharmaceutical transport negligence. Bradley looked at the telephone on the desk. He knew he had no other option. He had to make the call he swore he would never make. He had to beg. At exactly 2 in the morning, the phone in my small Southside apartment began to ring. I was sitting in my wobbly armchair, drinking a cup of warm tea and listening to a Miles Davis record on a portable turntable. I was completely calm, listening to the crackle of the record needle. I had been expecting this call since the moment the clock struck noon. I did not pick up the phone immediately. I let it ring 4 times, letting the mechanical bell echo in the quiet room. I wanted Bradley to sweat. I wanted him to feel the cold panic of the seconds ticking away. On the 5th ring, I picked up the receiver. Hello, I said. My voice was level, completely devoid of any emotion. Donald? Hey, Donald. Bradley's voice was high-pitched, thin, and breathless. He was trying to sound casual, like a son calling his father to check in, rather than a drowning man begging for a life vest. I hope I didn't wake you. I know it's late. But we have a bit of a situation down here at the headquarters. A situation? I repeated, letting the word hang in the air. Is that what you call it, Bradley? Yeah, it's just a minor technical glitch, Bradley said, letting out a forced, high-pitched laugh. The TempTrack software has entered some kind of safety lock. The IT guys say it's some legacy code that needs an administrative override. We figured since you know the old code better than anyone, you could come down and take a look. Maybe give us a hand. We can pay you a generous consulting fee. I took a slow sip of my tea. The sheer audacity of this boy was truly boundless. He had sent the police to put me in handcuffs 6 hours ago, and now he was offering me a consulting fee to fix his mess. You want me to come down there? I asked slowly. To the glass building I was banned from? To help the company that deactivated my badge? To assist the CEO who had me arrested in front of my neighbors? Bradley went quiet on the line. I could hear his shallow, ragged breathing through the speaker. Look, Donald, let's not dwell on the past, Bradley said, his voice tightening. We both said some things we didn't mean. The arrest. That was just a misunderstanding. The legal team got overzealous with the filings, trying to protect the company. It was a mistake, and I'll admit that. I can make all of that go away. I'll call the district attorney first thing in the morning and have the charges dropped. You'll drop the charges, I said, letting a cold smile touch my lips. That is very generous of you, Bradley. But I am not worried about the charges. The police already verified the holding company filings. They know I own the software. They know you are running pirated code on my trucks. Bradley's casual facade shattered. The polite corporate voice was replaced by pure panic. Okay, fine, Bradley yelled into the phone, losing his temper. You own the software. You made your point, Donald. You proved you are smart. Now please, just turn it back on. We are losing thousands of dollars a minute. The trucks are stalled on the highways, the drivers are freezing. Do it for the children's hospital. You always said you cared about the patients, right? Prove it. Turn the server back on. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dark Chicago streets. I do care about the patients, Bradley, I said, and I care about the drivers. That is exactly why I am doing this. I am saving BGL from you. What are you talking about? Bradley screamed, his voice breaking through the receiver. You're destroying the company. If we default on the TechStream contract, we are dead. The board will liquidate the firm. We are not dead, Bradley, I said, my voice cold and calm. You are. I am not coming down to the office tonight. But you have to, Bradley wailed. If the database wipes itself, there's nothing left. Everything my mother left me, it'll all be gone. You wanted to be the CEO, Bradley, I said. You wanted to be the big man in the tailored suit who makes all the big decisions. Well, this is what being in charge feels like. It feels like weight. It feels like real responsibility. You can't outsource this. You can't hire a consultant to carry your burden. I suggest you spend the rest of the night preparing your resignation speech. Because when I walk into that boardroom tomorrow morning, I am not coming as your stepfather. I am coming as your creditor. But I can't fix it, Bradley cried out, his voice cracking. I know, I said. That is the entire point. Good night, Bradley. I hung up the phone. On the other end of the line, in the red-lit executive penthouse, Bradley stared at the receiver, listening to the flat, monotonous dial tone. He dropped the phone, let out a primal scream of rage and despair, and grabbed an expensive crystal lamp from the side table, smashing it against the mahogany floor. But the red screens remained silent and unforgiving. Monday morning, 8 a.m. The executive boardroom of Becker Global Logistics was silent, but it was not a peaceful silence. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a courtroom before the jury delivers a verdict. The rain outside was beating against the glass windows of the skyscraper, mirroring the tension inside. The board members were all present, sitting around the long, polished conference table. They looked exhausted. They had spent the night watching the news reports of stalled trucks and ruined medical shipments. They had seen BGL's stock price drop by 30% in pre-market trading. Henderson, BGL's legal counsel, sat near the head of the table, his face pale and his folder closed. Bradley sat at the head of the table in my old leather chair. He looked like a ghost. His eyes were bloodshot, his tie was loose, and his designer suit was rumpled. He looked like a man who hadn't slept a single minute. Beside him sat Chloe, looking terrified, her fingers nervously twisting her diamond bracelet. At exactly 8:01 a.m., the heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open. I walked in. I was wearing my charcoal gray three-piece suit, my shoes polished to a mirror shine. I carried myself with the quiet authority of a man who had built every square foot of this building. Walking close behind me was Diana Albright, carrying her leather binder, and Otis, wearing a clean maintenance director uniform. Bradley tried to stand up, his hands shaking as he gripped the edge of the table. Donald, you came, thank God. Please tell me you brought the cryptographic key. We need to unlock the servers right now. Dominic is waiting on the line. I did not answer him. I did not even look at him. I walked slowly to the opposite end of the table and stood behind the empty chair. Otis stood to my left, his arms crossed, his grease-stained work cap held respectfully in his hand. He was looking at Bradley with a dry, mechanical calm that made Bradley shift in his seat. Bradley's panic flared into absolute anger, his face turning a deep red. He pointed a shaking finger at me and then at the board members, desperate to maintain some shred of control. This is illegal. You can't just walk in here with a fired mechanic and act like you own the place. My mother left me the majority shares of this company in her will. I own 51% of the stock. I am the legal owner of Becker Global Logistics. You cannot take that away from me. I sat down in the leather chair, folding my hands on the table. I watched him flail. It was like watching a man try to swim in deep quicksand. The harder he fought, the faster he sank. I looked at Diana and nodded. Diana stood up, opening the thick leather binder she had been carrying. The sound of the heavy paper turning was the only noise in the room. She adjusted her glasses and began to speak in a tone that was professional, clinical, and absolutely devastating. Mr. Bradley Becker is correct about one thing. Diana said, looking at the board. He does indeed own 51% of the stock in Becker Global Logistics Incorporated. That stock was left to him by the late Eleanor Becker. However, Bradley seems to fundamentally misunderstand what that stock actually represents. Bradley slammed his hand on the table. It represents the company. It represents the trucks, the warehouses, the software. Everything. No, it does not, Diana said calmly. Becker Global Logistics Incorporated is an operating entity. It is a service provider. It was created 15 years ago solely for liability and tax purposes. It does not own any physical or intellectual assets. None. The board members leaned forward. Representative Henderson from the Union Pension Fund frowned. Explain that, counsel. Diana pulled a diagram from the binder. Donald Becker is the sole owner of Becker Holdings, LLC. This holding company owns the legal titles to every single refrigerator truck in the fleet. It owns the deeds to the distribution warehouses in Chicago, Detroit, and St. Louis. It owns the trademark for the brand logo. And most importantly, it owns the patent and source code for the TempTrack software. For the past 10 years, Becker Global has operated under a master service lease agreement. It rents the trucks and licenses the software from Donald's holding company. In short, the operating company Bradley inherited is merely a tenant, and Donald Becker is the landlord. Bradley stared at Diana, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land. The corporate jargon, the arrogance, and the entitlement he had worn like armor for the last week evaporated in a second. He turned his eyes toward Henderson, BGL's legal counsel, silently pleading for him to dispute the claim. But Henderson did not look up from the table. He simply nodded slowly. "She is correct, Bradley," Henderson said, his voice quiet. "I reviewed the charter and the Secretary of State records this morning. BGL has never owned the fleet or the proprietary code. It operates entirely on lease agreements from Becker Holdings, LLC. But my mother, she left me the business," Bradley stammered, looking at me, then at the board members. "She told me she was leaving me her life's work. I have the majority share certificates." "She left you the operating rights, Bradley," Diana corrected him, her tone firm, clinical, and completely devoid of any family sentiment. "She left you the job and the responsibility of running the day-to-day biomedical logistics. But Eleanor was a smart woman. She knew you were young, inexperienced, and easily influenced. She and Donald agreed that the physical assets, the real wealth of this empire, would remain in the holding company under Donald's sole control. It was a safeguard, a way to ensure that if management ever failed, the hard assets wouldn't be seized by creditors or liquidated." I leaned forward, looking straight at Bradley. "Your mother was protecting BGL from someone exactly like you, Bradley," I said, my voice low and gravelly. "She knew that one day, someone might come along who cared more about status than substance. Someone who would spend the maintenance reserve on diamond bracelets and luxury parties. Someone who would fire the mechanics to make the spreadsheets look clean, sacrificing safety for a tech buzzword. She wanted to ensure that whoever ran the operating company could never sell the trucks to buy a yacht." Bradley looked like he was about to vomit. The board members sat in stunned silence. Chloe let out a quiet sob, her face buried in her hands. "What does that mean for us?" asked Henderson, the representative from the Union Pension Fund, looking at Diana. "It means," Diana said, closing the binder with a sharp snap, "that Bradley Becker owns 51% of nothing. The stock he holds is for a shell company that has no assets. Its entire value is derived from its lease contracts with Becker Holdings. And as of yesterday at noon, those lease agreements are void." I stood up slowly, walked to the whiteboard at the front of the boardroom, and picked up a marker. I drew a single large number on the white surface. 0. "This is the value of your inheritance as of this morning, Bradley," I said, turning to face the room. The board members stared at the board, then at me, their faces pale. They realized they had backed the wrong horse. They had bet on the jockey who wore the silk shirt rather than the owner who fed the horse. "Under the terms of the master service lease agreement," I said, reciting the clauses I had drafted with Eleanor decades ago in Diana's small office when we first incorporated the holding company. "We knew then that corporate disputes could arise, and we wanted to build a vault that could never be cracked by greed." The landlord reserves the right to terminate the lease immediately and recall all assets upon any material breach of contract. I am officially declaring 3 separate breaches. I held up one finger. Breach number 1, failure to maintain the assets. By firing Otis and the certified maintenance crew, you violated the maintenance clause of the BioShield pods, invalidating our FDA compliance. I held up a second finger. Breach number 2, insolvency. By spending the emergency reserves on marketing and private galas, you violated the financial stability covenants. I held up a third finger. And breach number 3, hostile action against the owner. By filing a false embezzlement claim and having me arrested to seize the holding company, you violated the good faith clause. I lowered my hand, looking at Bradley. Therefore, Becker Holdings LLC is repossessing every single truck, every BioShield pod, and every warehouse deed. We have revoked BGL's TempTrack software license, and we are removing our branding from the buildings. BGL has no assets, no cash, and no routing software. You have a list of customers and millions of dollars in TechStream debt, Bradley, but you have no means to generate a single dollar of revenue. You are the captain of a ghost ship. Representative Henderson stood up, looking at Bradley with pure venom. Is this true? Can he legally repossess the fleet? It is already done, I said. My team is currently down at the Chicago distribution yard, putting new registration decals on the trucks. The TempTrack servers have been updated to reject any login from BGL's domain. BGL is an empty shell, but the clients? Henderson asked, his voice filled with concern. The hospital networks? The pediatric contracts? I smiled. The clients want their oncology drugs and vaccines delivered safely. They don't care about the name on the invoice. Diana reached out to the major hospital accounts this morning. We offered them new logistics contracts directly with Becker Holdings, LLC. They all signed. Why wouldn't they? I have the trucks, I have the drivers, and I have the certified maintenance crew. Bradley has a hangover, a stack of unpaid bills, and a lawsuit. BGL is effectively a corpse, and Dominic is waiting to carve it up. The board members looked at each other. They realized that their fiduciary duty was to save BGL's pension funds and investments. They had 2 choices: stay on a sinking ship with Bradley and face lawsuits from TechStream and the FDA, or work with me to dissolve the shell and transfer the operational contracts. It was a choice between corporate suicide and survival. The vote to remove Bradley Becker as CEO of BGL was not a debate. It was a disposal. The board members did not even look at Bradley as they raised their hands. They looked at the spreadsheets. They looked at the millions in potential TechStream default penalties, and they looked at the zero revenue reality staring them in the face. Henderson called for the motion, and every single hand in the room went up. It was unanimous. In less than 60 seconds, the reign of the prince was over. Bradley stood at the head of the table, his knuckles white, as he gripped the back of the leather chair he had claimed was his birthright. He looked like a man who had been shoved out of an airplane without a parachute. He tried to speak, but his voice was thin, reedy, and shaking. "You cannot do this," Bradley stammered, looking at the board. "I am the majority shareholder. I have legal rights under the corporate bylaws. My mother's trust guarantees my position." "You have equity," Bradley, Henderson said coldly, closing his leather folder with a sharp click. "You do not have executive privileges. We are removing you for cause, gross negligence, breach of fiduciary duty, and for being the single greatest operational liability this company has ever faced. You are out, effective immediately." Bradley turned to me, looking for a shred of sympathy. He looked for the stepfather who used to bandage his scraped knees, but that man was gone. That man had been arrested in front of his neighbors. The man sitting across from him now was the owner of the holding company, and I had no mercy left to give. "I suggest you pack your things, Bradley," I said. "Security will escort you to the elevator. You have 10 minutes to clear your personal items from the office." Bradley turned to Chloe, who was standing near the double doors. She had been quiet, hoping to fade into the woodwork, hoping the lightning would only strike her husband. "Come on, Chloe," Bradley said, reaching for her hand. "We are leaving. We will call our lawyers and sue them for everything." Chloe pulled her hand away. She looked at Bradley with a mixture of disgust and anger. "We?" she asked, her voice sharp. There is no we, Bradley. You are the one who got fired. You are the one who ruined our lives and destroyed the company. I am not going anywhere with you. Bradley stared at her, his mouth opening and closed. Even in his final moment of defeat, his partner in greed was abandoning him. But before Bradley could take a step toward the exit, Diana Albright stood up. She cleared her throat, a sharp, commanding sound that stopped both of them in their tracks. "Not so fast, Mr. Becker," Diana said, pulling a new set of folders from her briefcase. "And you too, Mrs. Becker. Please take a seat. The board meeting is adjourned, but the legal inquiry is just beginning." Bradley stopped, frowning. "What are you talking about? I don't have to listen to you. I'm leaving." "You can leave, Bradley," Diana said, opening the file and sliding a stack of document copies onto the table. "But I do not think you will make it very far. You see, while Donald was restructuring the asset leases, I took the liberty of conducting a forensic audit of the operating accounts for the last 6 months. Specifically, the discretionary spending and maintenance reserve accounts that you and your wife have been accessing." Chloe made a sudden move toward the double doors, but Mike, the security guard, stepped in front of her. He crossed his massive arms, his face blank. Deanna slid the stack of bank statements down the long table, the papers fanning out to reveal page after page of highlighted transactions. The maintenance fund that Donald established was strictly for fleet upkeep and emergency equipment replacement, Diana explained to the board. However, according to these audited records, $300,000 was transferred out of that fund in the last 2 weeks alone. It was not paid to mechanics or valve suppliers. Diana picked up the top sheet, reading the entries. $50. Vauzana was paid to a luxury event planning firm for the launch gala. $20,000 to a jeweler in Paris for a custom diamond bracelet. $10,000 for a weekend stay at a luxury spa in Aspen. Diana looked up, locking eyes with Chloe. "And my personal favorite, $15,000 for a private wardrobe consultation listed in the corporate ledger as uniform redesign." The board members gasped. Representative Henderson picked up one of the statements, his hands shaking with rage as he read the numbers. "This is theft," he whispered. "This isn't just mismanagement. This is criminal fraud. You stole emergency maintenance funds while the trucks were failing on the highway." "But there's more," Diana said. She pulled out a final sheet. "Last Friday, Bradley authorized a wire transfer of $150,000 from BGL's payroll escrow account to an offshore shell company. That money was used as a down payment for a luxury sports car registered in Bradley's name. That is why the driver's checks bounced this morning, gentlemen. Bradley did not just spend the reserves, he stole the driver's wages. It was a marketing expense," Bradley yelled, sweat pouring down his face. "BGL needed a new image to attract big pharma clients. We had to look successful. It was all for the brand." "A sports car is not marketing, Bradley," Diana said, her voice cutting like a razor. Chloe began to cry, a loud, theatrical sobbing. She pointed a finger at Bradley. "He made me do it. He told me BGL had plenty of cash and that he was the owner now. I am the victim here. I didn't know the money came from the maintenance or payroll accounts." "You're a liar, Chloe," Bradley roared, turning on her. "You chose the jeweler in Paris. You booked the Aspen trip. You told me that if I didn't buy you these things, you would leave me for someone who could." They stood there, in the center of the boardroom, shouting at each other, tearing down whatever remained of their marriage. It was an ugly spectacle, the raw rot of their greed exposed to the light of the morning. They weren't partners anymore. They were accomplices turning on each other the moment the heat got too high. The board members watched in silence, their expressions a mix of disgust and disbelief. Before Bradley could launch into another defense, the double doors of the boardroom swung open once again. 4 men in dark blue windbreakers stepped into the room. On the back of their jackets, the word police was printed in bold yellow letters. They were followed by 2 detectives in plain suits. These weren't the local precinct officers Bradley had manipulated to arrest me. These were detectives from the State Economic Crimes Division, specialized in corporate corruption and state securities fraud. They carried folders of their own, and they looked like they had been working all weekend. One of the detectives stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room until they settled on Bradley and Chloe. He pulled a sheet of paper from his pocket. Bradley Becker and Chloe Becker? The detective announced, his voice booming in the quiet room. I am Detective Vance from the State Police Financial Crimes Unit. We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of grand larceny, corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and securities violation. Bradley froze. The sweat was dripping down his chin now. He looked at the detectives, then at the window, as if calculating the distance to the street below. Then, his eyes darted to me. His expression changed from fear to absolute desperation. He reached out his hands. Donald, tell them, Bradley stammered, his voice cracking. Tell them it was just a corporate accounting error. I'll pay the money back. Every single dollar, I swear. Just don't let them take me. You're the founder. They'll listen to you. Speak to them, Donald. Please. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting flat on the mahogany table. I looked at him. I did not blink. I cannot help you, Bradley, I said, my voice low and steady. I am just the landlord. I don't interfere in the tenant's business, especially when that business is a federal crime. The detectives moved in. They did not use gentle hands. One of them grabbed Bradley's arm, spinning him around, forcing his hands behind his back. The metallic click of the cuffs, ratcheting shut, echoed in the boardroom. You can't do this, Bradley yelled as the metal bit into his wrists. This is a family company. Donald, please! Chloe screamed, a high-pitched, wild sound. She backed away toward the corner of the room, her eyes darting like a trapped animal. Keep your hands off me, she shrieked as a female officer stepped toward her. I am a Becker. I have a trust fund. She tried to dodge past the officer, running toward the exit, but she tripped on the carpet in her designer high heels. She fell hard onto the polished wood, her purse spilling open, her gold card sliding across the floor. The officer pulled her up, twisting her arms behind her back, and clicked the cuffs shut. Chloe was crying now, her mascara running down her cheeks, her power suit covered in dust. Let's go, Detective Vance said, guiding Bradley toward the door. The procession of shame moved slowly along the length of the boardroom table. The board members turned their chairs away, refusing to look at the disgraced CEO and his wife. Bradley dragged his feet, looking small and broken. He stopped just 2 feet away from my chair. The detective shoved him, but Bradley planted his feet, staring down at me. His face was streaked with sweat and tears. The arrogance was entirely gone, replaced by the terror of a child who has realized his parents aren't coming to save him. Dad, Bradley whispered. The word hung in the air. He hadn't called me that in 20 years, not since he went to college and decided his stepfather's blue-collar work was embarrassing. I did not look up. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead, focused on the empty leather chair at the head of the table. The chair Eleanor had bought for me. The chair I had earned with 30 years of sweat. I reached out, placing my hand on the cool leather of the armrest. Get him out of here, I said to the empty air. The detective shoved Bradley forward. Bradley let out a low moan of despair as they pushed him through the double doors. Chloe was still screaming in the hallway, her voice fading as they led them toward the service elevator. The elevator doors dinged, and then there was silence. The board members did not waste any time. Henderson called for a vote on the restructuring agreement Diana had prepared. It was a complete asset swap. The BGL shell would be dissolved, and all operations would be transferred to Becker Holdings LLC. The board members signed the documents one by one. The boardroom felt lighter. The smell of expensive perfume and corporate panic was already fading, replaced by the honest smell of coffee and old paperwork. I stood up, walked to the head of the table, and pulled out the large leather chair. I sat down. The springs groaned slightly under my weight, a familiar, welcoming sound. I spun the chair around to face the large window. Down below, on the congested streets of Chicago, the white refrigerator trucks of Becker Global Logistics were beginning to flow through the intersections. Their BioShield pods safely powered, protecting the critical pediatric oncology drugs that had been stalled. I could see them flowing through the arteries of the city. I turned back to face the board. They were all watching me, waiting for orders. Gentlemen, I said, opening my folder, the cleanup is over. Now we rebuild. Let's get to work. I stood up from the executive chair and nodded to Otis. Let's go down to the basement, Otis. It's time to turn the engine back on. We took the private elevator down to the sub-basement server room. The air down there was cold and hummed with the high-frequency vibration of dozens of server racks. Every rack was glowing with that angry crimson light. The central mainframe cabinet had a steel lockbox mounted to the door, housing a small glass scanner. I stepped up to the panel. I pressed my right thumb against the glass. For a second, nothing happened. The scanner glowed blue, reading the unique ridges of my skin, matching them against the master encryption keys hard-coded into the chips a decade ago. Then, the box let out a soft, high-pitched chirp. The red lights on the server racks flickered, turned black for 3 seconds, and then, one by one, returned to a steady rhythmic green hum. Upstairs, the command center monitors shifted. The solid red blocks disappeared, replaced by the map of North America. The green lights indicating our 3,000 trucks popped back onto the screen, moving along the digital highways. The BioShield cooling loops hummed to life, restoring BGL's operations to 100% compliance. BGL's heartbeat was back, but the hardest part of any corporate war is not the fighting. It is the cleanup. I walked down from the executive penthouse to the main Chicago loading dock. It was a massive concrete space, smelling of diesel, cardboard, and honest physical work. I had asked Mike, the head of security, to gather everyone. The drivers who had been stranded, the warehouse workers whose scanners had been dead, the dispatchers who had been blamed, and the remaining mechanics. They stood in a large semicircle around a stack of wooden shipping pallets. They looked tired, anxious, and deeply worried. They had watched their colleagues get fired. They had seen BGL almost collapse in 5 days. They did not know if I was there to save them, or to announce that we were selling the business. I did not stand on a raised podium. I stood right on the concrete floor, level with their boots, looking at the faces of men and women I had known for 20 years. "I owe you all an apology," I said, my voice echoing off the concrete walls. "I let this happen. I built this company to be a fortress, but I left the gate unlocked. I thought that by stepping back, I was giving the next generation a chance to lead. I was wrong. I gave a loaded corporate weapon to an entitled child who didn't know the difference between a piston and a spreadsheet. Because of my mistake, you suffered. Your checks bounced, your insurance was threatened, and your jobs were put at risk. For that, I am truly sorry." The warehouse was silent. They were not used to hearing apologies from a founder, let alone a multi-millionaire. Bradley had never apologized to a worker in his life. "But apologies don't pay the mortgage," I continued, raising my voice. "And apologies don't guarantee this won't happen again. This week taught me a valuable lesson. A logistics empire cannot belong to just one family. Characters get weak, bloodlines get thin, and greed takes over. The only people who truly care about the survival of this company are the people who sweat for it every single day." I signaled to Diana, who handed me a folder of legal agreements. "As of this morning," I announced, "we have dissolved the old operating corporation. BGL is gone. We are forming a new company, Becker Biologistics Holdings. And under our new charter, 30% of the company's stock is being permanently transferred into an employee stock ownership plan." A murmur went through the crowd. The drivers looked at each other, not quite understanding. "It means you are not just employees anymore," I said, a smile finally touching my face. "It means you are owners. If the company makes a profit, you make a profit. If the company grows, your retirement fund grows. And most importantly, it means no CEO can ever sell this company out from under you or fire the experienced crew because the employees hold a voting block on the board of directors. You own the engine now." The silence broke. It started with Otis, who clapped his large, calloused hands. Then Mike joined in, then the dispatchers, and then the drivers. Within seconds, the concrete loading dock was shaking with the sound of roaring cheers and heavy applause. It was the sound of loyalty returned. I spent the next 2 hours on the dock, shaking hands and signing checks from my personal account to cover the bounced payroll Bradley had stolen. I looked at their faces, and for the first time since Eleanor's death, I felt like I was home. After the crowd dispersed, I called Otis into my office. The office was still painted neon orange, but we would paint over that tomorrow. I placed a new plastic security badge on the mahogany desk. It read, "Otis, Director of Fleet Operations, Otis stared at the badge, wiping his grease-stained hands on his pants before touching the plastic. Donald, I fix valves. I don't sit in executive meetings. I don't wear a tie. You don't need a tie, Otis, I said. You need your 35 years of experience. Bradley fired the experts because he was threatened by them. I am promoting you because I need you. You know these BioShield pods better than the engineers who built them. I need you to run maintenance, train the young guys, and ensure no Becker truck ever stalls in a blizzard again. And Otis, take this iPad. You'll need it to approve the maintenance budget. Otis let out a booming laugh, picked up the badge and pinned it to his shirt. He walked out of the office, standing a little taller. He wasn't a dinosaur anymore. He was the director. While we were busy rebuilding the company from the concrete floor up, the world outside the steel and glass tower was tearing Bradley and Chloe apart. The news of BGL's collapse and the subsequent arrest of the high-profile young couple went viral within hours. The internet, as it always does, proved to be an incredibly swift and merciless judge. For years, Chloe had carefully curated a perfect, sparkling online life. She had posted daily photos of her designer clothes, her custom jewelry, her luxury vacations in Aspen and Paris, and BGL's sleek new corporate office, bragging about her rise to the top. She had used BGL's capital to build a personal brand based on wealth and status, making thousands of strangers envy her. But now, the velvet curtain was violently pulled back. Social media did not pity her, it devoured her. The police mugshot of Chloe Becker, with her expensive makeup ruined, mascara running down her cheeks, and her blonde hair in a messy tangle, was trending on every major platform. People began to go back through her historical posts, dissecting the dates and pointing out that the luxury items she had bragged about were purchased using stolen truck maintenance funds and bounced driver payroll checks. "Nice diamond bracelet," one comment read. "Too bad it was paid for with the wages of frozen truck drivers." Another user posted a video clip of Chloe screaming at a warehouse employee from a few months ago with the caption, "This is the real face of the modern tech heiress." Her follower count dropped from 100,000 to 0 overnight as thousands of people unfollowed or blocked her. Every single brand partnership she had secured issued immediate press releases distancing themselves from her, canceling their contracts. Her online presence was completely incinerated in a matter of 24 hours. She had lived for the superficial applause of strangers, and now she was corporate roadkill, a viral warning sign for anyone who thinks wealth can be manufactured through image alone. She was no longer an influencer, she was a cautionary tale. As for Bradley, the legal experts on the news channels were already predicting a 5-year federal prison sentence. The paper trail Henderson and Diana had uncovered was simply too clean, too documented to dispute. Bradley had signed the bank transfers himself, believing he was untouchable as the majority shareholder. He would spend the remainder of his 30s in a concrete cell, with plenty of hours to think about the difference between price and value. By the time Friday evening arrived, the office was quiet. The sun began to set over the Chicago skyline, painting the clouds a deep, bruised purple that faded into black. The emergency red screens were gone, replaced by the steady, green hum of the monitors displaying BGL's operational health. The trucks were moving, the deliveries were on time, and the clients were satisfied. I walked through the quiet hallways of the executive suite. I stood in the doorway of the boardroom, looking at the whiteboard where I had drawn the large 0 on Monday morning. The board members were gone, the lawyers were gone, and the poison had been completely cleared from the system. The ghosts of Bradley's brief, toxic reign had been evicted. I walked to BGL's master switchboard, turned off the non-essential office lights, and headed down to the garage. My reserved VIP parking spot next to the elevator was empty. The Lincoln Town car sat parked there, clean, polished, and waiting. Bradley had returned the keys, but as I stood looking at it, I realized I didn't want to drive it. It felt like part of the corporate housing, a symbol of the executive package that had almost choked the life out of this business. I walked past the Lincoln, heading into the dark, dusty back corner of the underground garage. Parked in the last bay, beneath a layer of concrete dust, was a rusted 1995 Ford F-150. It was the first refrigerator truck I had ever bought, the vehicle Eleanor and I had used to haul our first loads of insulin in the winter of 1996. I had kept it all these years, personally maintaining the engine, replacing the gaskets, and greasing the valves myself on weekends when I needed to clear my head. I pressed the heavy driver's side door handle. The hinges let out a dry, mechanical creak that echoed in the concrete garage. I climbed into the cabin. The bench seat was worn, the fabric split in the center, and the interior smelled of old leather, copper solvent, and dust. It was a familiar, honest smell. I jammed the ignition key into the slot and turned it. The starter motor whined for a second, and then the old V8 engine turned over with a rough, mechanical roar that shook the dashboard. The cabin vibrated with a raw, unrefined energy. It didn't have a digital display or an iPad mount. It didn't have a predictive routing algorithm. It just had torque, steel, and a full tank of fuel. I rested my calloused hands on the thin plastic steering wheel, listening to the steady, rhythmic idle of the engine. It was the sound of honesty. It was the sound of the foundation. Bradley and Chloe had taken the fancy desk and the glass tables, but they had never understood that the real power of this empire wasn't in the penthouse. It was in the garage. I released the mechanical parking brake and put the old truck in gear. The transmission engaged with a solid, satisfying clunk. I drove out of the dark underground bay, heading up the concrete ramp toward the streetlights of Chicago. The winter sky was clear now, and the headlights cut through the dark, strong and bright. I wasn't heading back to the Lake Forest mansion. BGL's lawyers had already locked the gates to preserve the estate assets. I was heading to a quiet, peaceful place. I drove north, away from the neon lights of the city center, heading toward the quiet suburbs where the streets were lined with tall oaks and the air was clean. The V8 engine of the old F-150 hummed a low, comforting song, vibrating through the metal floorboards and into my boots. It felt like driving a piece of my own past. I did not go to a hotel. I did not go back to the wobbly rental on the south side. I drove directly to the cemetery. The heavy iron gates were unlocked, left open for the evening visitors. I turned the truck onto the narrow gravel path, driving slowly past the rows of marble headstones that stood like silent sentinels in the moonlight. I kept my headlights as low, not wanting to disturb the absolute peace of the final resting places. The V8 engine puttered to a stop, the hot manifold ticking in the cold air. The sudden silence of the night was heavy, but it was not empty. I climbed out of the cab, the cold wind hitting my face. I walked up the grassy hill, my work boots crunching softly on the frozen ground. I knew the path by heart. I didn't need the moonlight to guide me. I stopped at Eleanor's grave. The mound of earth was still fresh, the dark Illinois soil looking black against the gray grass. The massive wreaths of expensive white lilies Bradley and Chloe had ordered for the funeral had died. Their petals turned brown, dry and shriveled by the frost. They looked like corporate props that had served their purpose and been discarded. I knelt down on the cold grass. My joints ached, a reminder of the 68 years of mileage on my own frame, but I ignored the pain. I began to clear the dead flowers away, throwing the shriveled wreaths into a nearby refuse bin. I wanted her grave to be clean. I wanted it to look honest. Once the dirt was clear, I reached into my coat pocket. My fingers closed around the heavy brass ring holding the keys to BGL's C-suite and the Lake Forest mansion. The keys Bradley had demanded I surrender, the keys BGL's legal counsel had returned to me this morning. I placed the ring gently on the polished granite of the headstone. "I did it, Eleanor," I whispered, my voice rough and barely louder than the wind. "I saved it. It got a little messy, and I had to be a hard man, someone you might not have liked to see for a few days. But the house is clean now. The poison is out." I leaned my hand against the cold stone, wishing I could feel her warmth. "I saw Bradley when the detectives let him out, Eleanor," I continued. "He looked so small. He tried to call me Dad, a word he hadn't spoken since he was a kid. He thought I would save him. He thought that family meant he could steal the wages of BGL's drivers and buy luxury sports cars, and I would cover for him. But I had to let him face the law. If I had stepped in, he would have spent the rest of his life thinking the world owed him a living." I took a slow breath, looking down at the granite. "The drivers got their checks today," I continued. "I paid them from our private account. Otis is the new director of operations, and he's already got the crew overhauling the refrigeration units. Otis was wearing his new badge, Eleanor. He looked so proud. He tried to tell me he doesn't know how to use a tablet, but I told him his hands are certified and BGL needs his experience. We gave the senior crew their jobs back, every single one of them. We even gave them a raise to compensate for Bradley's bounced checks. The board dissolved the shell, and BGL is officially gone. The new company belongs to the workers now. We gave them 30% of the stock. Your legacy is safe, Eleanor. Nobody can ever sell BGL to buy a yacht again. I paused, listening to the wind rustling the oak branches above. The silence was heavy. I miss you, I said, a tear finally escaping and running down my cheek, freezing in the winter air. The Lake Forest house is empty, and BGL's lawyers are going to sell it to settle BGL's debts. I'm renting a small place on the south side, not far from where we first started. It's quiet there. The radiator clanks just like the one in our first apartment. Sometimes, I swear I can hear you complaining about the heat. I touched the carved letters of her name. I'm going to keep working, Eleanor, I whispered. I'm not ready to retire yet. There's a whole generation of young mechanics who need to learn how to turn a wrench, and Otis needs my help running the new ESOP. You always told me that a real legacy isn't what you leave for people. It's what you leave in them. I'm going to make sure we leave something solid in these kids. I stood there on the grass for another 15 minutes, just listening to the night. I didn't feel the cold. I only felt the quiet peace of a promise kept. The battle was won. The corporate parasites had been cleared out, and BGL was back in the hands of the people who built it. I stood up slowly, brushing the frozen dirt from my trousers, and looked out at the distant lights of Chicago. They looked different tonight, glowing softly against the dark expanse of the horizon. They didn't look like financial assets or data streams on Bradley's phone screen. They looked like warm lights in the windows of families. Families whose children were waiting for the medicine my trucks were currently carrying safely through the sub-zero night. I walked back down the grassy hill, leaving the heavy brass key ring sitting on the cold granite headstone. I didn't look back. I had left the burden of the past behind, and the future was waiting for me at the bottom of the hill. I climbed back into the warm cabin of the F-150, closed the heavy door with a solid, satisfying thud, and turned the key. The V8 engine roared to life once more, filling the quiet cemetery with its rough, honest vibration. I put the truck in gear and drove slowly back down the gravel path, passing through the iron gates and heading back toward the south side. As I drove through the quiet Chicago streets, I couldn't help but reflect on the wild storm of the last 2 weeks. It was a tragedy of errors, born from the simple, classic human flaw of greed. Bradley and Chloe had believed they could bypass the hard work, the grease, and the years of relationship building. They had believed that by painting the office orange, hosting a fancy launch party at the Ritz-Carlton, and using buzzwords like paradigm shift and synergy, they could magically transform a blue-collar trucking company into a modern tech startup. They had focused entirely on the image, ignoring the foundation. They did not realize that a company is not a screen. It is a living, breathing machine made of steel, rubber, and human trust. If you don't grease the valves, the engines will freeze. If you don't pay the drivers, the trucks will stop. And if you treat the people who build the engine like disposable line items on a spreadsheet, the entire structure will collapse around you. Bradley had wanted the glory of the crown, but he had refused to carry the weight of the shield. He had assumed that my blue-collar past made me weak, not realizing that the grease under my fingernails was the armor that had protected this company for 40 years. Eleanor had seen it coming. Her love for her son was deep, but her wisdom was deeper. She had known that the only way to save Bradley from himself was to build a corporate structure that he could never dismantle. She had left him the key to the front door, but she had handed me the combination to the vault. It was a hard, painful love, but it was the only love that could have preserved what we built. The transition from BGL to Becker Biologistics Holdings was remarkably smooth, though it required dozens of hours of legal and financial restructuring. Under the new ESOP structure, the warehouse was buzzing with a new kind of energy, a pride that had been missing for a very long time. The drivers weren't just punching a clock anymore. They were checking the inventory counts and oil levels like it was their own personal property, because it was. When a driver noticed a small drop in the refrigeration temperature on a route near St. Louis, he didn't wait for a system ticket to escalate. He called Otis immediately, and Otis had a mobile mechanic on site in 20 minutes. We didn't need an outsourced call center. We didn't need a predictive AI algorithm to tell us when a truck was failing. We had the eyes and ears of 3,000 owners who cared about the cargo. I settled into my small South Side apartment. The Lake Forest mansion was sold a month later, and the proceeds were used to settle the remaining TechStream default penalties Dominic had tried to enforce. We settled with him for 20 cents on the dollar. Once he realized I had repossessed the trucks and the clients, Dominic knew his legal position was weak. He was a corporate shark, but he was a smart shark. He didn't want to waste millions on a lawsuit he couldn't win against a landlord who owned the physical assets. Every morning at 5 a.m., I drive my old Ford F-150 to the Chicago distribution yard. I don't sit in the executive penthouse anymore. We leased that space to a software firm and moved the administration offices back to a trailers and brick building next to the loading docks. I spend my mornings in the service bays, wearing my old canvas work shirt, working alongside Otis and the apprentice mechanics. We teach them how to inspect the valves, how to grease the seals, and how to listen to the rhythm of a cooling compressor. We show them that a machine will tell you exactly what is wrong if you pay attention, and that shortcuts always lead to a breakdown on the road. We are building the next generation of master technicians. It is dirty work, it is hard work, but it is the work that keeps the medicine cold, and the children safe sometimes. When the garage is quiet and the smell of diesel and oil is heavy in the air, I look at the empty passenger seat of my old truck and think of Eleanor. I know she would be proud of what we did. We didn't just save a business, we saved a community. We proved that in a world obsessed with shortcuts and digital illusions, there is still no substitute for honest labor, physical reality, and absolute loyalty. If you found Donald's story of justice, family boundaries, and legacy inspiring, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of corporate revenge and real-life triumphs. It really helps the channel grow, and it keeps us bringing you these high-quality, deep-dive narratives of family drama and corporate showdowns. And I want to hear from you in the comments section below. Do you think Donald did the right thing by letting Bradley and Chloe face the full consequences of the law? Or should he have stepped in to save his stepson? I read every single comment, and your feedback helps me bring you the stories you want to hear. Thank you for watching, and remember to protect what you build.